14 days, no food, no radio contact. 5 men vanished into the Vietnamese jungle, and when they emerged, they had accomplished what the entire American military machine could not do in 18 months. What you are about to hear was buried in Pentagon archives for 40 years. Classified. Sealed. Forgotten. And there's a reason they did not want you to know this story. In March of 1969, a small team of Australian SAS operators walked into Triple Canopy Jungle on a mission so secret that even today, the names of the men involved remain redacted from official records. Their target was an NVA general, whose intelligence network had been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Allied soldiers. The Americans had thrown everything at this problem. Satellites, spy planes, agent networks, millions of dollars in technology. They found nothing. The Australians found him in 6 days, and they eliminated him without firing a single shot. How? How did 5 men succeed where an army of thousands had failed? What methods did they use that the Pentagon refused to adopt? And why did American commanders bury the reports that could have saved tens of thousands of lives? The answers will shock you. These men ate raw snakes. They stopped bathing for days before a mission so the enemy could not smell them. They learned tracking techniques from Aboriginal hunters, techniques developed over 40,000 years. They became something that the Viet Cong called Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and the enemy feared them more than any American battalion. But here is what the official histories will never tell you. The price these men paid. The psychological scars they carried for the rest of their lives. The suicides, the broken families, the faces that appeared in their nightmares decades after the war ended. This is not a story of simple heroism. This is a story of what happens when ordinary men are transformed into something extraordinary, and what that transformation costs. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation, the secret that connects this 50-year-old mission to the way special forces operate today, will change everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. This is the untold story of the 14-day patrol, and it starts now. The American intelligence officer stepped off the helicopter at Nui Dat in March of 1969, and immediately knew something was wrong. The base smelled different. Not the familiar stench of diesel and cordite that defined every U.S. firebase in Vietnam, but something earthier, almost feral. Then, he saw them emerging from the tree line. 5 figures so caked in mud and vegetation that they seemed to have been vomited up by the jungle itself. These were Australian SAS operators returning from a patrol that officially never happened, carrying intelligence that would change the entire American understanding of special operations in Southeast Asia. But what this officer was about to witness would haunt him for the rest of his life. The patrol had been in the jungle for 14 days. 14 days without resupply. 14 days without radio contact. 14 days surviving on rainwater collected in leaves, raw snake meat, and sheer willpower. They had covered over 120 kilometers through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, evaded an estimated 400 North Vietnamese Army regulars, and accomplished something the entire American intelligence apparatus had failed to do for 18 months. They had located, tracked, and eliminated a senior NVA general, whose command had been responsible for the deaths of over 300 Allied soldiers. And here is what truly stunned the American observer. Not a single shot had been fired. The general had been dispatched with a knife, in absolute silence, in the middle of a camp containing over 200 enemy soldiers. The patrol had then exfiltrated without leaving a single trace that they had ever been there. The NVA did not discover their commander's fate until morning, and even then, they attributed it to an internal assassination rather than enemy action. This was not warfare as the Americans understood it. This was something else entirely. Something that combined the tracking skills of Aboriginal hunters with the patience of professional assassins and the physical endurance of ultramarathon runners. But the methods behind this impossible mission were only the first secret the Pentagon would bury. The Pentagon would spend the next 5 years trying to replicate these capabilities, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into training programs that never quite succeeded. Because what made the Australian SAS so devastatingly effective in Vietnam could not be bought with money or taught in classrooms. It had to be earned through a selection process so brutal that it made the American Special Forces qualification course look like a summer camp, and refined through operational experience that pushed human beings to the absolute limits of physical and psychological endurance. Yet this story is not simply about military effectiveness. It is about what happens to men who spend years becoming something more than human in their capabilities, while simultaneously becoming something less than human in their emotional lives. It is about the price paid by those who mastered the dark arts of jungle warfare, and about the secrets that governments on both sides of the Pacific have worked diligently to keep buried. What you are about to learn has been pieced together from declassified documents, veteran testimonies, and sources who spoke only on condition of absolute anonymity. Some of what follows will disturb you. Some will fill you with pride. All of it will change your understanding of what Australian soldiers accomplished in the jungles of Vietnam, and why that accomplishment remains one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the entire conflict. The origins of the patrol that would eliminate the NVA general can be traced back to an intelligence failure of staggering proportions in late 1968. American Signals Intelligence had identified a new NVA command structure operating in Phuoc Tuy province, coordinating attacks that seemed to anticipate every American operation with uncanny accuracy. Someone inside this command structure either had access to Allied planning documents or possessed an intelligence network so sophisticated that it bordered on the supernatural. The Americans threw everything they had at the problem: aerial, reconnaissance, agent networks, electronic surveillance, even experimental satellite imagery that would not be officially acknowledged for another decade. They found nothing. The NVA command structure moved like smoke, never staying in one location for more than 48 hours, never using radio communications that could be intercepted, never leaving traces that could be followed. But the Australians had noticed something the Americans had missed entirely. By February of 1969, the American commander, responsible for the sector, had essentially given up. His after-action reports from that period, recently declassified, reveal a tone of frustrated resignation. The enemy command elements had demonstrated an operational security capability that exceeded current counterintelligence resources. The recommendation was acceptance of current attrition rates, pending development of new technical solutions. In plain English, we cannot find them, we cannot stop them, and we should simply accept that American soldiers will continue to perish until someone invents a better way to locate the enemy. The Australians refused to accept this conclusion. They had been developing alternative methods since 1966, when the first SAS squadrons deployed to Vietnam, and immediately recognized that American approaches were fundamentally unsuited to this conflict. The Americans relied on technology, firepower, and speed. They would insert large forces by helicopter, sweep an area with overwhelming violence, and extract before the enemy could concentrate against them. This approach generated impressive body counts, but rarely achieved lasting results. The Viet Cong and NVA simply melted away when the Americans came, waited for them to leave, and then resumed operations as if nothing had happened. Worse, the reliance on helicopters made American movements completely predictable. The enemy could hear the aircraft coming from kilometers away and had ample time to prepare. The Australians took a radically different approach, one that would eventually be called the Ghost Patrol Doctrine, though the men who practiced it rarely used such dramatic terminology. They simply called it going bush. And going bush meant becoming something that their enemies would learn to fear above all else. An Australian SAS patrol typically consisted of 5 men who would insert by helicopter, but at a distance of 10 to 15 kilometers from their actual area of operations. They would then spend the next 2 to 3 days moving on foot to their objective, traveling primarily at night, using routes that no sane person would consider passable. They carried no rations that required cooking, used no lights or radios except in absolute emergencies, and applied fieldcraft techniques that rendered them essentially invisible to enemy detection. The first element of this invisibility was olfactory. The Americans never quite understood how the Viet Cong seemed to know exactly where their patrols were moving, despite excellent noise, discipline, and careful concealment. The answer was embarrassingly simple. The enemy could smell them. American soldiers reeked of soap, insect repellent, tobacco, coffee, and a dozen other scents that were utterly alien to the jungle environment. A trained tracker could detect an American patrol from hundreds of meters away simply by following his nose. The Australians eliminated this vulnerability through a protocol that their American counterparts found almost primitive. For 3 days before a patrol, SAS operators stopped using any soap or hygiene products. They ate only rice and fish sauce, the same diet consumed by the local population. They rubbed their skin and equipment with the same vegetation found in their operating area. By the time they inserted into the jungle, they smelled exactly like their environment, an amalgam of rotting vegetation, stagnant water, and the particular earthy musk of the Vietnamese highlands. The American intelligence officer who visited Nui Dat would later write that the returning patrols smelled like something that had crawled out of a swamp and died. He meant it as an insult. The Australians took it as a compliment. But the smell doctrine was only the beginning of what made these men invisible. The second element was acoustic discipline carried to an extreme that bordered on the obsessive. An Australian SAS patrol could move through dense jungle for hours without making a sound louder than the natural background noise of the forest. This was not simply a matter of walking carefully. It required an almost supernatural awareness of one's body and surroundings, knowing exactly where to place each foot, how to shift weight without snapping twigs, how to move through vegetation without disturbing it in ways that would alert birds or monkeys. The men practiced these skills until they became automatic, until silent movement was as natural as breathing. They also developed hand signals so sophisticated that they could communicate complex tactical information without making a single sound, even in complete darkness. A raised fist meant immediate halt. A flat palm facing down meant go to ground. A finger pointing at the eyes followed by a directional gesture meant enemy spotted at that location. Dozens of these signals existed, each one practiced thousands of times until the patrol could function as a single organism without ever breaking silence. Yet even this was not what truly set the Australian SAS apart from every other force in Vietnam. The third element was what the Americans found most difficult to replicate. The Australians had recruited Aboriginal trackers as instructors, and had systematically incorporated indigenous hunting techniques into their tactical doctrine. These were skills that had been developed over 40,000 years of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. and they translated with remarkable effectiveness to the jungles of Vietnam. An Aboriginal trained tracker could read the jungle like a book. He could identify enemy presence from signs so subtle that they were invisible to untrained eyes. A bent blade of grass, a displaced stone, an insect pattern that indicated recent human passage. He could determine not just where the enemy had been, but how many there were, how long ago they had passed, what they were carrying, and even their probable destination. This was not magic, though it sometimes appeared that way to observers. It was the application of ancient knowledge to modern warfare, and it gave the Australians an advantage that no amount of technology could match. The American intelligence officer who arrived at Nui Dat had heard rumors about Australian capabilities, but he had dismissed most of them as exaggeration or propaganda. Special operations communities are notorious for cultivating mystique around their activities, and the officer assumed that the stories about Australian super soldiers were simply the Pacific version of the same myth-making that surrounded American Green Berets. What he witnessed over the following days would comprehensively destroy that assumption. The patrol that had just returned was led by a sergeant whose name remains classified even today, a man who had completed 4 tours in Vietnam and was regarded by his peers as something approaching a jungle deity. The American officer would later describe him as possessing an almost preternatural awareness of his environment and tactical instincts that appeared to border on the extrasensory. This was not mysticism. It was the product of thousands of hours of operational experience combined with natural aptitude and training of exceptional rigor. But to an observer unfamiliar with the methods that produced such capability, it looked very much like something supernatural. The sergeant's patrol had been tasked with locating the elusive NVA command structure that had been evading American intelligence for 18 months. They had been given a search area of approximately 400 square kilometers of triple canopy jungle, mountainous terrain, and enemy-controlled villages. They had no satellite imagery, no signals intelligence, and no agent networks to guide them. They had only their training, their experience, and an operational approach that prioritized patience over action. What happened during those 14 days would become one of the most studied operations in Special Forces history, though the full details would not be declassified until 2009. 40 years after the events occurred. And even then, significant portions remained redacted. The patrol inserted by helicopter on the evening of March 3, 1969, landing in a small clearing approximately 12 kilometers northeast of their suspected target area. Within 60 seconds of touchdown, they had disappeared into the jungle, leaving no trace that they had ever been there. The helicopter crew reported seeing the men for perhaps 5 seconds before the vegetation swallowed them completely. This was standard procedure. The faster a patrol disappeared, the less opportunity enemy observers had to note their location or direction of travel. For the first 3 days, the patrol moved in absolute silence toward the area where intelligence suggested the NVA command might be operating. They traveled primarily at night, covering no more than 2 to 3 kilometers per 24-hour period, a pace that would have been unacceptably slow for an American unit, but was essential for the Australians' methodology. Speed was the enemy of stealth, and the Australians understood that finding the target was worthless if the target detected them first. They moved in a formation that placed the tracker at point, reading the jungle for any sign of enemy presence, with the patrol commander immediately behind him, ready to make instant decisions based on what the tracker observed. On the 4th day, everything changed. They found the first trace of their quarry. It was almost laughably insignificant, a small area where the vegetation had been disturbed in a manner inconsistent with animal movement. An untrained observer would have walked past it without a second glance. But to the Aboriginal trained tracker, it told a detailed story. 2 men had passed this point approximately 36 hours earlier, moving northwest at a cautious pace. They had been carrying heavy loads, probably supplies rather than weapons, based on the depth and pattern of their footprints. They had stopped briefly to rest and had departed without eating or drinking, suggesting that their destination was not far away. Most importantly, they had made no attempt to conceal their passage, indicating that they felt secure in this area. They believed they were far from any Allied observation. This complacency would prove to be their commander's fatal mistake. The patrol adjusted their route to follow this trail, moving even more slowly now, acutely aware that they were entering enemy territory. The tracker read the signs like a navigator reading a map, following the invisible path that the enemy supply bearers had left through the jungle. Several times, he stopped the patrol with a raised fist, indicating danger ahead, and they would freeze in position for 30 minutes or more, while he analyzed some subtle anomaly in the environment. These pauses would have driven an American patrol to distraction, but the Australians understood their purpose. A single mistake at this stage would compromise not just the mission, but their lives. Patience was not merely a virtue. It was a survival imperative. But the jungle was about to test their patience in ways none of them had anticipated. On the 6th day, they encountered their first direct evidence of the enemy command structure. The patrol was moving along a ridgeline when the tracker suddenly dropped to one knee, his hand signal indicating immediate halt. For the next 20 minutes, no one moved. Then, slowly, The tracker pointed to a location approximately 300 meters below their position. Through the jungle canopy, barely visible even with binoculars, the patrol commander could make out the shapes of camouflage structures. A base camp of significant size. They had found the enemy's lair. But finding the camp was only the first step, and the most dangerous phase of the operation was about to begin. The patrol's mission was not simply to locate the NVA command, but to identify the specific individual who led it and, if possible, to eliminate him, without alerting the enemy to Allied intelligence capabilities. This required a level of close observation that pushed the boundaries of what was considered operationally feasible. The patrol would need to establish a position close enough to observe the camp's internal activities while remaining completely undetected by a security perimeter that almost certainly extended for hundreds of meters in all directions. They would need to maintain this position for days, surviving without resupply, movement, or significant rest. And they would need to do all of this while remaining prepared for instant action if the opportunity to eliminate the target presented itself. The sergeant selected an observation position approximately 150 meters from the camp perimeter, close enough to observe individual faces with binoculars, but separated from the camp by terrain so difficult that enemy patrols rarely ventured into it. The position was a small depression in the jungle floor, hidden beneath a fallen tree and surrounded by vegetation so dense that a person standing 5 meters away would be unable to detect the patrol's presence. What happened over the next 8 days would push these men to the absolute limits of human endurance. The physical conditions were almost indescribably brutal. The jungle floor was a seething mass of insects, leeches, and venomous creatures. The humidity approached 100%, and the men were constantly soaked in a mixture of rainwater and their own sweat. They could not move to relieve muscle cramps, could not speak, could not light fires or prepare food. They urinated where they lay and managed their bowels through a careful protocol that minimized movement and odor. For 2 of the men, this period of absolute stillness triggered psychological episodes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One would later be diagnosed with severe claustrophobia that made it impossible for him to enter enclosed spaces, a direct result of the days spent immobile in that jungle prison. Another would develop a condition that his doctors never fully understood, a persistent sensation of insects crawling beneath his skin that no medication could fully suppress. But the intelligence they gathered was beyond anything the Americans had obtained in 18 months of effort. Over 8 days of continuous observation, the patrol mapped the camp's entire structure, identified its defensive positions, cataloged its daily routines, and, most importantly, identified the man who appeared to command it. He was a senior officer, almost certainly of general rank based on the deference shown to him by the camp's other occupants. He appeared in the camp's central area each morning at approximately 0700 hours and each evening at approximately 1900 hours, apparently to receive briefings from his subordinates. He moved with the careful confidence of a man who had survived many years of war, always accompanied by 2 bodyguards who scanned their surroundings with professional vigilance. He slept in a bunker at the camp's center, accessible only through a narrow entrance that was guarded around the clock. Any attempt to reach him in his bunker would be suicide. But the patrol had noticed something else, a vulnerability that would prove to be the general's undoing. On the afternoon of the 12th day, the opportunity presented itself. Observation had revealed that the general had a habit of walking to a small stream approximately 50 meters from the camp perimeter each evening before sunset, accompanied by only 1 bodyguard. He would spend 15 to 20 minutes at this location, apparently in meditation or contemplation, before returning to the camp for his evening briefing. The stream was at the bottom of a small ravine, hidden from the camp's defensive positions by intervening terrain. If the patrol could reach that ravine undetected, they would have access to the target in a relatively isolated location with a viable exfiltration route already identified. It was the kind of opportunity that might never come again. The sergeant made his decision. They would move that night. They would position themselves in the ravine before dawn. The following evening, when the general made his customary walk, they would strike. The method would be silent. Knives only. No firearms under any circumstances. The bodyguard would be neutralized first, then the general. The patrol would then exfiltrate immediately, moving northwest toward a predetermined extraction point approximately 20 kilometers away. If everything went according to plan, the enemy would not discover what had happened until morning, giving the patrol a 12-hour head start before pursuit could be organized. But in the jungle, nothing ever goes entirely according to plan. What happened over the next 36 hours would become one of the most analyzed close-target operations in Special Forces history, studied at military academies around the world as an example of what determined men can accomplish when doctrine, training, and opportunity align perfectly. It would also become one of the most controversial, raising questions about the ethical boundaries of targeted elimination that continue to resonate in debates over modern drone warfare and special operations methodology. The patrol began their movement at 0200 hours, departing their observation post with the same silent discipline that had characterized their entire operation. The distance to the ravine was approximately 200 meters, but it took them nearly 4 hours to cover it. Every step was calculated, every movement analyzed for potential noise or visual exposure. The jungle at night is never truly dark. Bioluminescent fungi, reflected starlight, and the eyes of nocturnal creatures create a dim illumination that can reveal movement to alert observers. The patrol moved in this half-light, like men underwater, each motion smooth and deliberate, their breathing controlled to minimize any sound. By 0600 hours, they had reached the ravine and established their position. The location was nearly perfect. A small hollow in the stream bank, concealed by overhanging vegetation, with clear sightlines to the point where the general typically stopped during his evening visits. The patrol commander positioned himself and one other operator in the primary ambush site, while the remaining 3 men established a blocking position approximately 30 meters downstream, ready to intercept anyone who might flee in that direction or respond from the camp. Now came the hardest part of all: waiting. The day that followed was among the longest any of those men had ever experienced. They could not move, could not speak, could barely breathe above a whisper. The stream attracted insects in enormous numbers, and the men endured hours of biting flies and mosquitoes without so much as raising a hand to brush them away. The tension was almost unbearable. They were approximately 50 meters from a camp containing over 200 enemy soldiers, preparing to eliminate a target whose disappearance would trigger a massive response. If anything went wrong, if they were detected, if the general changed his routine, they would almost certainly not survive. Each minute stretched into an eternity, each sound from the camp sending adrenaline surging through bodies that had no outlet for the energy. And then, at 1847 hours, the moment arrived. The general appeared. He emerged from the tree line above the ravine, accompanied by his bodyguard as expected, and began the careful descent toward the stream. The patrol commander tracked his movement through the undergrowth, his hand resting on the handle of his knife, his entire being focused on the approaching figure. Decades of training, years of operational experience, thousands of hours of preparation had led to this moment. Everything depended on the next 5 minutes. The general reached the stream bank and stopped at his customary spot, a flat rock approximately 3 meters from the patrol commander's position. His bodyguard remained standing approximately 5 meters behind him, scanning the surrounding jungle with the automatic vigilance of professional security. The general appeared to be completely relaxed, his attention focused on the flowing water before him. He had no idea that he was being observed from less than a body length away, that men with knives were waiting in the undergrowth, that his life was now measured in minutes rather than years. The patrol commander waited. This was the most difficult part, resisting the instinct to strike immediately, allowing the target to settle into his routine, waiting for the precise moment when both the general and his bodyguard would be most vulnerable. Patience, as the Aboriginal instructors had taught, was the hunter's greatest weapon. Prey that feels secure becomes careless. The successful hunter exploits that carelessness with perfect timing. At 1852 hours, the moment arrived. The bodyguard had turned to examine something in the undergrowth behind him. Perhaps a noise, perhaps simply routine scanning. The general was bent forward, his hands touching the water, his neck exposed. The patrol commander moved. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. The commander emerged from concealment like a striking snake, covering the 3 meters to the general in a single fluid motion. His knife found the target's throat before the man could turn, before he could cry out, before he could do anything but cease to exist. Simultaneously, the second operator engaged the bodyguard, who had begun to react to the movement beside him, but was far too slow. 2 men who had been alive and alert 5 seconds earlier were now crumpling to the ground, their lives ended with a clinical precision that spoke to thousands of hours of training and techniques that most soldiers never learn. But the mission was far from over, and the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The patrol did not pause to verify what needed no verification. Within 30 seconds of the strike, they were moving northwest, leaving the bodies exactly where they had fallen. The stream would carry any blood traces away from the immediate scene. The jungle would reveal nothing to pursuers. By morning, when the general's absence would first be noticed, the patrol would be over 8 kilometers away, moving toward extraction with the quiet confidence of men who had accomplished the impossible. That was the plan. The jungle had other ideas. Approximately 6 hours after the strike, while moving through an area of particularly dense jungle, the patrol encountered an enemy supply column, approximately 40 NVA soldiers moving along a trail that intersected their escape route. The patrol went to ground immediately, concealing themselves within meters of the passing enemy, their hearts pounding as dozens of armed men walked past close enough to touch. The column was larger than anything they had expected to encounter. Intelligence had suggested this area was lightly trafficked, a gap in the enemy's supply network. Instead, they had stumbled into what appeared to be a major logistics route, with soldiers and porters streaming past in a seemingly endless procession. The patrol lay frozen in the undergrowth, barely breathing, as minute after agonizing minute passed. And then one of the NVA soldiers stepped off the trail. Perhaps he needed to relieve himself. Perhaps he was simply curious about something he had glimpsed in the vegetation. Whatever the reason, he walked directly toward the hollow where 2 patrol members were concealed. He was perhaps 3 meters away when he stopped, apparently sensing that something was wrong. His eyes scanned the undergrowth, searching for the source of his unease. For perhaps 5 seconds, an eternity to the men who lay frozen in the vegetation, he stood there, his rifle rising slowly toward a ready position. If he raised an alarm, the entire column would engage. The patrol was outnumbered 8-1, with minimal ammunition and no prospect of reinforcement. The patrol commander made an instant decision. He rose from concealment, closed the distance to the NVA soldier in 2 quick steps, and took him down with a technique that special forces do not discuss in public, a method of silent elimination that is quick, efficient, and utterly brutal. The soldier made no sound. He simply ceased to exist as a living being, his body lowered carefully to the ground by the man who had just ended his life. The patrol then remained in position for another 45 minutes, while the remainder of the column passed, the lifeless NVA soldier lying among them like a 6th member of their formation. Each passing minute brought the possibility that someone would notice their missing comrade, that a search would be initiated, that the silent figures in the undergrowth would be discovered. But the column passed without incident, disappearing into the jungle as if it had never been there. This incident would haunt the man who carried it out for the remainder of his life. The soldier who was eliminated had not yet identified the patrol's position. He had not raised his weapon to fire. He had not called out to his comrades. He was simply a young man who had stepped off a trail to investigate something unusual, and for this curiosity, he paid with his life. Was this elimination justified as a defensive measure? Was it an act of war, or something closer to homicide? The men who executed the mission had no time for such philosophical distinctions. They acted on training, instinct, and the imperative of survival. But in the years that followed, as they reflected on what they had done and who they had become, the answers became less clear. The face of that young soldier would appear in dreams, asking questions that had no satisfactory answers. The patrol reached their extraction point approximately 18 hours after the strike on the general, having covered over 20 kilometers of hostile terrain while evading multiple enemy patrols. A helicopter lifted them out at dawn on March 18, 1969, ending a mission that had lasted 14 days and had accomplished objectives that the entire American intelligence apparatus had deemed impossible. The immediate results were everything the commanders had hoped for. The NVA command structure in Phu Quoc Tuy province would never fully recover from the loss of their leader. Within 6 months, the attack patterns that had plagued Allied forces began to lose their predictive accuracy, and casualty rates in the province dropped by nearly 40%. Lives were saved. Australian lives, American lives, South Vietnamese lives. But the true cost of the mission would not become apparent for years. Of the 5 men who participated in the patrol, 3 would struggle with severe psychological difficulties for the remainder of their lives. One would take his own life in 1978, leaving a note that spoke of jungle dreams and faces that would not stop appearing in the darkness. Another would spend decades battling substance dependency, self-medicating against memories that no therapy could fully address. The third would become a recluse, retreating to the Australian outback and living in near-complete isolation until his passing in 2004. Only 2 members of the patrol would go on to lead anything resembling normal lives, and even they carried scars that they rarely discussed and never forgot. The transformation required to become an effective jungle operator had changed them at a fundamental level. Changes that could not be reversed simply by returning to civilian society. They had become the ghosts that their enemies feared. But ghosts are not fully human. The American intelligence officer who witnessed the patrol's return to Nui Dat would write a classified report that attempted to explain what he had observed. His analysis ran to over 40 pages and included detailed descriptions of Australian methodology, training practices, and operational doctrine. He concluded with a recommendation that the United States military establish a program to study and replicate Australian capabilities, noting that the cost of such a program would be a fraction of the expense currently being devoted to technological solutions that have demonstrably failed to achieve equivalent results. His recommendation was rejected. The classified reasoning given was that Australian methods were unsuited to American operational culture and potentially difficult to scale to the manpower requirements of a major force deployment. The real reason, which would not emerge until documents were declassified decades later, was simpler and more damning. American commanders did not want to acknowledge that a small allied nation, with a fraction of their resources, had developed capabilities that far exceeded their own. Such an acknowledgement would have been politically embarrassing and potentially devastating to military careers that depended on demonstrating the superiority of American methods. So the officer's report was classified, his recommendations were ignored, and American soldiers continued to fight and perish, using tactics that their own intelligence services had identified as inadequate. This is the part of the story that has been most carefully buried, and it is the part that remains most relevant to understanding the true nature of what the Australian SAS accomplished in Vietnam. They were not simply better soldiers, though they were certainly that. They were proof that the entire American approach to the war was fundamentally flawed. Proof that technology could not substitute for skill, that firepower could not replace patience, that institutional arrogance was costing lives that might otherwise have been saved. The Pentagon knew this as early as 1969. They had the reports, they had the evidence, they had the recommendations of their own officers. They chose to ignore all of it. The methods that the Australian SAS pioneered in Vietnam would eventually be adopted by American Special Operations Forces, but the adoption would take decades. The small unit tactics, the emphasis on indigenous methods, the patience-based approach to reconnaissance and targeting, all of these would become central to American special operations doctrine by the early 2000s. But this transformation came too late for the tens of thousands of American and Allied soldiers who might have been saved if the lessons of Vietnam had been learned when they were first offered. And the men who could have taught those lessons were never asked. The Australian intelligence community has never fully acknowledged the mission against the NVA general. Official histories refer to it obliquely, if at all, using language that neither confirms nor denies that such an operation occurred. Veterans who participated have been bound by security restrictions that, in some cases, persist to this day. The families of the men involved have often learned of their loved ones' experiences only through fragmentary accounts, deathbed confessions, or the occasional moment of vulnerability when the walls of secrecy momentarily cracked. Children have grown old wondering what their fathers saw in those jungles, why they woke screaming in the night, why they could never quite connect with the civilian world around them. This silence has served multiple purposes. It has protected operational methods that remain relevant to contemporary special operations. It has shielded individuals from potential legal consequences in an era when the rules governing targeted elimination have become increasingly complex. And it has allowed the Australian government to maintain the official position that its forces in Vietnam operated strictly within the established laws of armed conflict. But the silence has also caused harm that can never be fully measured. The men who executed these missions were given no public acknowledgement of what they accomplished, no recognition of the prices they paid, no official validation of their sacrifices. They returned to a society that either did not know or did not care what they had done, and they were expected to reintegrate into civilian life as if their experiences had been no different from those of ordinary soldiers. Some managed this transition successfully, many did not. The psychological toll of prolonged jungle operations, combined with the moral weight of close-quarters elimination and the isolation of secrecy, created wounds that no medal or ceremony could heal. Meanwhile, the lessons their experience offered were being systematically ignored. The NVA general whose life ended on that stream bank in March of 1969 has never been officially identified in Australian or American records. His name appears in Vietnamese military histories as a casualty of the conflict, but the circumstances of his passing are described only vaguely. An ambush, an enemy operation, the fortunes of war. His family may never know exactly what happened to him, just as the families of the Australian operators may never fully understand what their fathers and grandfathers experienced in those 14 days of jungle hell. The silence protects everyone and no one. It preserves secrets that perhaps should be preserved and buries truths that perhaps should be told. What we can say with certainty is this. A small group of Australian soldiers accomplished something that the mightiest military machine in history could not. They found an enemy that technology could not locate, eliminated a target that conventional forces could not reach, and exfiltrated from a situation that would have destroyed any unit operating by standard doctrine. They did this through methods that their own allies refused to adopt, using skills that were dismissed as primitive, employing patience in an age that worshipped speed. And they paid for this accomplishment with pieces of their souls that they would never fully recover. The origins of the capabilities that made the 14-day patrol possible can be traced back years before Vietnam, to the jungles of Borneo and Malaya, where the Australian SAS first developed its distinctive approach to warfare. Understanding how those methods evolved requires going back to the earliest days of Australian special operations, to training grounds where ordinary men were transformed into something that their enemies would learn to fear above all else. But that transformation came at a cost that no one fully understood at the time. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment was formally established in 1957, drawing inspiration from the British SAS, but adapting its methods to the unique challenges of operations in the Asia-Pacific region. From the beginning, Australian planners recognized that their forces would likely operate in jungle environments against enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and conditions. This recognition drove a training philosophy that emphasized bushcraft, tracking, and indigenous survival techniques to a degree that had no parallel in other Western special operations forces. The selection process was designed not just to identify physical fitness, but to reveal psychological characteristics that would prove essential in the demanding environment of jungle operations. Patience, self-reliance, the ability to function effectively in isolation. The first combat deployment of Australian SAS came during the Malayan Emergency, a counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas that would provide invaluable lessons for the Vietnam conflict that followed. In Malaya, Australian operators learned that the jungle was not an obstacle to be overcome, but an environment to be mastered. They learned that the enemy could be tracked, predicted, and ambushed using techniques that had nothing to do with advanced technology and everything to do with patience, observation, and skill. Most importantly, they learned that Western soldiers could operate effectively in tropical environments that had traditionally been considered hostile to European military methods, provided they were willing to adapt completely to local conditions. These lessons would prove decisive in Vietnam, but only for those willing to learn them. The Malayan experience produced a generation of SAS operators who understood jungle warfare at an almost instinctive level. These men became the instructors and mentors for the units that would deploy to Vietnam. Passing down knowledge that could not be found in any manual or taught in any classroom, they emphasized the importance of moving slowly, of observing everything, of never assuming that technological superiority could substitute for tactical awareness. They taught their students to think like hunters rather than soldiers, to see the jungle as a hunting ground rather than a battlefield, to approach every operation with the patience and precision of men whose survival depended on getting every detail exactly right. This mentorship model ensured that institutional knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, creating a continuity of capability that no amount of formal training could replicate. By the time the first Australian SAS squadrons deployed to Vietnam in 1966, they brought with them a doctrine that had been refined through years of operational experience. They also brought something equally important: a selection and training process that ensured only the most capable individuals would be entrusted with the demanding missions that lay ahead. The selection process alone eliminated over 80% of candidates who attempted it. The Australian SAS selection course was, and remains, among the most demanding military qualification programs in the world. Candidates are subjected to weeks of physical and psychological stress, designed to identify those who possess not just physical endurance, but mental resilience, tactical judgment, and the ability to function effectively under conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. Sleep deprivation, extreme physical exertion, psychological pressure, and deliberate disorientation are combined to reveal the true character of each candidate. Those who pass demonstrate not just toughness, but adaptability. The ability to think clearly when every instinct screams for rest, to make sound decisions when every factor encourages panic. But selection was only the beginning of what these men would endure. Those who passed faced months of additional training that covered every aspect of special operations methodology, from advanced combat techniques to communications, demolitions, medical skills, and the specialized tradecraft of reconnaissance and surveillance. The training was relentless, pushing candidates to failure again and again until the required skills became automatic, until excellence became habit rather than aspiration. But the most important training came later, when newly qualified operators were assigned to experienced patrol teams and learned their craft through direct mentorship from veterans who had already proven themselves in combat. This apprenticeship model ensured that the lessons of Malaya and Borneo were not lost, that each new generation of operators inherited the accumulated wisdom of those who had gone before. The American military observer who visited Nui Dat in 1969 was struck not just by what the Australian SAS operators could do, but by how they had learned to do it. The entire system, selection, training, mentorship, operational methodology, was designed to produce a very specific type of soldier. One who could operate independently for extended periods in hostile environments, who could make life or death decisions without reference to higher authority, and who could accomplish complex missions with minimal resources and support. These were not the characteristics that American military culture typically valued. American doctrine emphasized centralized command, massive firepower, and the technological solutions that their industrial economy could produce in seemingly unlimited quantities. The Australian approach was almost the opposite. Decentralized authority, minimal firepower, and human skills that required years to develop and could not be purchased at any price. This philosophical difference would prove decisive in Vietnam, though the Americans refused to acknowledge it. The American approach generated impressive statistics. Millions of tons of bombs dropped, billions of rounds fired, thousands of enemy killed. But it failed to achieve its fundamental objective of defeating the communist insurgency. The Australian approach generated far more modest numbers, but achieved results that were proportionally far more significant. Australian units consistently outperformed their American counterparts in every metric that mattered. Enemy eliminated per friendly casualty, intelligence gathered per patrol, area controlled per soldier deployed. The ratio of Australian effectiveness to resources expended was so high that American commanders initially refused to believe the reports they received, assuming that the Australians must be exaggerating their accomplishments or using different counting methods. They were not exaggerating. The results were real. And they reflected a fundamental truth about warfare that the American military establishment was reluctant to acknowledge. Technology is a force multiplier, not a substitute for capability. A skilled operator with a rifle is more effective than an unskilled operator with an arsenal. A patient patrol that locates the enemy is more valuable than a dozen airstrikes against empty jungle. Human judgment, developed through rigorous training and operational experience, remains the decisive factor in military operations, regardless of how much money is spent on weapon systems and technological solutions. The 14-day patrol that eliminated the NVA general was the ultimate demonstration of this principle. 5 men, carrying minimal equipment, accomplished an objective that had defeated the entire American intelligence apparatus for 18 months. They did it not through superior technology, but through superior skill. Not through overwhelming firepower, but through perfect patience. Not through institutional support, but through individual capability developed over years of demanding preparation. Their success was a vindication of the Australian approach and an implicit condemnation of the American alternative. But vindication and condemnation are easy to pronounce from the safety of historical distance. At the time, in the chaos and confusion of a war that was already beginning to seem unwinnable, the significance of what the Australian SAS accomplished was understood by only a few observers. And even fewer were willing to draw the obvious conclusions. The psychological toll of what these men experienced would not become apparent for years. The selection process that identified them, the training that shaped them, the operational experience that forged them, all of these had created individuals who could not be satisfied with ordinary achievement, who measured themselves against standards that most people could not even imagine, who found meaning in the relentless pursuit of excellence even when that pursuit led into darkness. But the darkness they entered was not the kind that lifts with the sunrise. The transformation required to become an effective jungle operator involved changes that went far deeper than physical conditioning or tactical training. It required the development of instincts that were closer to those of a predator than a civilized human being. It required the suppression of emotional responses that might interfere with operational effectiveness. It required the acceptance of moral ambiguities that most people never have to confront. The men who underwent this transformation became capable of things that ordinary soldiers could not do. But they also became something that ordinary people could not fully understand or accept. They had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed, entered a territory from which there was no complete return. The Viet Cong and NVA came to call them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and they meant it as a statement of terrified respect. But ghosts are not fully human, and the men who earned that name paid for it with pieces of their humanity that they would never fully recover. This is the hidden cost of elite military capability, the price that societies pay when they create warriors who can accomplish the impossible. These men serve their countries with extraordinary dedication and effectiveness, but they return from their service changed in ways that make reintegration difficult and sometimes impossible. They have seen things that cannot be unseen, done things that cannot be undone, become things that cannot be reversed. They deserve support and understanding from the societies that send them into harm's way. But they often receive only neglect, incomprehension, or the hollow rituals of formal recognition that substitute for genuine acknowledgement. The Australian SAS veterans of Vietnam experienced all of these outcomes. Some received the support they needed and managed to build fulfilling lives after their service. Some struggled for years with psychological difficulties that were poorly understood at the time and inadequately treated by the available services. Some never recovered at all, joining the tragic ranks of veterans whose survival skills, so effective in combat, proved inadequate to the challenges of peacetime existence. The statistics of veteran suicide, substance dependency, and social dysfunction tell a story that no medal or ceremony can address. The story of men who gave everything they had and received far less than they deserved in return. The passage of time has brought some improvements. Contemporary understanding of combat trauma is far more sophisticated than it was in the 1970s, and the support services available to veterans have expanded significantly. But the fundamental challenge remains. How does a society honor those who sacrifice their well-being in its service? How does it acknowledge debts that can never be fully repaid? How does it remember sacrifices that were made in secret for reasons that cannot be fully explained, in ways that cannot be publicly discussed? There are no easy answers to these questions, but perhaps the first step toward addressing them is simply telling the truth, acknowledging what was done, recognizing who did it, and honoring the cost that was paid. The 14-day patrol and the mission it accomplished represent only a small fraction of what Australian SAS operators achieved in Vietnam. But they also represent the larger truth that has been obscured by classification, institutional embarrassment, and the passage of time. That a small group of extraordinary individuals accomplished things that changed the course of the conflict and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. They deserve to be remembered, not as legends or myths, not as paragons of impossible virtue, not as symbols that can be manipulated for political purposes, but as men who answered a call, faced challenges that most people cannot imagine, and paid prices that most people will never understand. They were human beings with human flaws, operating in circumstances that brought out both the best and the worst of human nature. The consequences of the American refusal to learn from Australian methods would extend far beyond Vietnam. When the United States military finally began to seriously reform its special operations capabilities in the 1980s and 90s, much of what was presented as innovation was actually rediscovery, the reinvention of methods that the Australian SAS had proven effective decades earlier. The emphasis on small unit operations, the integration of indigenous skills and knowledge, the patience-based approach to reconnaissance and targeting, the development of operators who could function independently in austere environments, all these were lessons that could have been learned from the Australian experience in Vietnam. Instead, they were learned again, at great expense, through the trial and error of subsequent conflicts. This pattern of forgetting and relearning is one of the great tragedies of modern military history. Knowledge that is gained at enormous cost in blood and suffering is allowed to fade from institutional memory, only to be rediscovered by a new generation that pays the same price to learn the same lessons. The cycle continues because military organizations are inherently conservative, resistant to change, and protective of institutional interests that may not align with operational effectiveness. It continues because political leaders rarely have the expertise to evaluate military advice critically, and often defer to commanders whose careers depend on validating existing approaches. It continues because the men who possess the most relevant experience are often the least likely to be heard. They are too junior, too unconventional, or too threatening to established hierarchies to have their voices amplified. The Australian SAS operators who served in Vietnam understood this dynamic, even if they could not articulate it in such terms. They knew that what they had learned would probably be forgotten, that their methods would probably be abandoned, that the hard-won knowledge they had accumulated would probably die with them. This knowledge added another layer of burden to the psychological weight they already carried. It is one thing to sacrifice for a cause. It is quite another to sacrifice for a cause that will not remember the sacrifice or honor the lessons that the sacrifice taught. Yet they continued to serve, continued to deploy, continued to accomplish missions that no one else could accomplish. They did this not because they expected gratitude or recognition, but because it was who they were. Men who had chosen a path and were determined to walk it regardless of where it led. The selection process that had identified them, the training that had shaped them, the operational experience that had forged them. All of these had created individuals who could not be satisfied with ordinary achievement. The 14-day patrol was one expression of this drive for excellence, but it was far from the only one. Throughout their deployment, Australian SAS squadrons conducted operations that consistently exceeded expectations and frequently accomplished objectives that had been deemed impossible. They gathered intelligence that saved lives, eliminated targets that disrupted enemy operations, and created a climate of fear and uncertainty in areas that had previously been safe havens for communist forces. The Viet Cong and NVA came to dread the silent patrols that appeared without warning, struck without mercy, and vanished without trace. The name Ma Rung spread through enemy ranks like a contagion, and commanders began to report that their soldiers were refusing to patrol in areas where the jungle ghosts were known to operate. This psychological impact was as valuable as any tactical success. Fear is a weapon that requires no ammunition and generates no logistical burden. When enemy soldiers begin to hesitate before entering contested areas, when they start seeing threats in every shadow and hearing footsteps in every silence, their operational effectiveness degrades in ways that cannot be measured by body counts or intelligence reports. The Australian SAS created this fear systematically, deliberately, and with full understanding of its operational value. But weapons that cut one way often cut both. The men who became objects of terror for their enemies also became strangers to themselves and to the society they had left behind. The American intelligence officer, who witnessed the patrol's return in 1969, retired from military service in 1982. In his personal papers, discovered after his passing in 2011, researchers found a single sheet of paper that appeared to be a personal reflection on what he had observed. He wrote that he had seen the future of warfare, and it terrified him, not because of its violence — he had witnessed violence in many forms — but because it required men to become something other than men, to embrace darkness in service of light, to sacrifice their humanity for objectives that history may or may not vindicate. The Australians had shown him what was possible when human beings push beyond normal limits. They had also shown him the cost. He was not certain the exchange was worth making, but he was certain that we would continue to make it, because war demands what war demands, and those who answer that demand deserve more than our forgetting. He never published these reflections. He never spoke of what he had witnessed, except in classified settings. He carried the knowledge of the 14-day patrol to his grave, another keeper of secrets in a conflict that generated more secrets than any war in history. The truth of what happened in those jungles exists now only in fragments, in documents that researchers must fight to access, in memories that grow hazier with each passing year, in the faces of old men who sometimes wake in the darkness and listen for sounds that no longer come. The jungles of Vietnam have long since healed over the trails that Australian SAS patrols once walked. The base at Nui Dat is now a peaceful agricultural area where the sounds of combat have been replaced by the sounds of normal life. The men who served there have aged into their 70s and 80s, their numbers diminishing with each passing year. Soon, there will be no living witnesses to what happened in those jungles, no voices to correct the errors of historical memory, no one to say, "I was there," when the stories are told. Before that silence falls, the stories need to be recorded. The truth needs to be told. The sacrifices need to be acknowledged. Not because the men who made those sacrifices require acknowledgement — most of them have long since made their peace with anonymity — but because the societies that benefited from their service have an obligation to remember. That obligation exists regardless of whether the remembering is comfortable, regardless of whether the stories reflect well on institutional decision-making, regardless of whether the truth challenges assumptions that people would prefer to maintain. The 14-day patrol happened. The NVA general was eliminated. The intelligence was gathered. The lives were saved. The prices were paid. These are facts, documented in classified archives that are slowly becoming accessible to researchers and historians. The full story may never be told. Too much has been lost to classification, to fading memory, to the deaths of those who witnessed events firsthand. But what can be told should be told. Because the alternative is a silence that dishonors both the men who served and the societies that sent them. The Australian SAS operators who served in Vietnam were not supermen. They were ordinary Australians who were selected for extraordinary duty, trained to extraordinary standards, and placed in extraordinary circumstances. What made them exceptional was not some innate quality that set them apart from other human beings, but rather the systematic development of capabilities that any motivated individual could theoretically acquire. They proved that human potential, properly cultivated, can achieve results that technology cannot match. They proved that patience, discipline, and skill can overcome advantages of numbers and firepower. They proved that small groups of determined individuals can change the course of events in ways that large organizations cannot. These are not comfortable lessons for military establishments that depend on expensive weapons systems and large force structures. They are not comfortable lessons for governments that prefer technological solutions to the messy business of developing human capital. They are not comfortable lessons for societies that would rather not think too carefully about what is done in their name in distant jungles and desert compounds. But they are true lessons nonetheless, validated by experience, confirmed by results, and available to anyone willing to learn them. The 14-day patrol ended more than half a century ago, but its echoes continue to reverberate through military doctrine, intelligence methodology, and the ongoing debate over how modern nations should project power in an increasingly complex world. The men who executed that mission are mostly gone now, their memories fading into history, their sacrifices known only to a diminishing circle of family, friends, and fellow veterans. But what they accomplished endures, a proof of concept that changed the way special operations are conducted, a demonstration of human capability that continues to inspire those who follow in their footsteps, and a reminder that the most sophisticated technology is ultimately no substitute for the most ancient of military virtues: courage, skill, patience, and the willingness to do whatever duty requires, regardless of cost. They lived on rain and snakes for 14 days. They disappeared into the jungle and emerged having accomplished the impossible. They paid prices that most of us cannot imagine and carried burdens that most of us will never understand. And they deserve to be remembered. Not as legends or myths, but as men who did what their country asked and lived with the consequences. The methods that the American military finally adopted in 2003, small unit operations, cultural integration, patience-based targeting, were the same methods that Australian sergeants had tried to teach American lieutenants in 1969. The doctrine that revolutionized American special operations in the War on Terror was the doctrine that had been proven effective in the jungles of Puuc Tuy province more than 3 decades earlier. 50,000 American names are carved into a black wall in Washington, D.C. How many of those names might still be attached to living men and women if the lessons of the Australian SAS had been learned when they were first offered? That question has no answer. But it deserves to be asked. The patrol that disappeared into the jungle in March of 1969 accomplished its mission. By any conventional military measure, the operation was an unqualified success. But success in warfare is never unqualified. It always comes with costs that cannot be measured in body counts or territorial gains. The 5 men who walked out of that jungle carried burdens that would never fully lift, memories that would never fully fade, questions that would never be fully answered. And now, more than 50 years later, their story can finally be told. Not completely, not with every detail verified, not without gaps that may never be filled, but told nonetheless. Because stories like theirs deserve to be remembered even when they cannot be fully understood. Because the men who serve deserve recognition even when that recognition comes too late. Because the lessons of their experience remain relevant even when those lessons continue to be ignored. And because the truth, however incomplete, is always preferable to the comfortable silence of forgetting. That is their story. That is their legacy. That is the secret that was buried for half a century and can finally, incompletely, be told. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The Pentagon called their reports classified. Now you know why.